Welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by the Bangalore International Centre. BIC has fostered over 250 informed discussions, dialogue, and cultural enterprise in its new premises since 2019. BIC Talks bring ideas and conversations ever closer to you.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. Also with me today is Ravichandar. This is our first transcontinental recording with journalist, foreign affairs columnist and author Chidanand Rajghatta joining us from Washington, D.C. Chidanand, welcome to BIC Talks.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you.
Chidanand, though you're joining us from the other side of the world, you're very much from Bangalore, right? So it's great to have our first American guest on the show also actually be from Bangalore.
Absolutely. I'm a total Manni Namaga, although I've been away for many, many years, 25 plus years in the US.
And you will continue to be. Chidanand, I wish we were recording this under happier circumstances. Unfortunately, things have been going terribly awry in the world. And that is a gross understatement, actually. And as we record this on April 14th, we are seeing, I think, 500,000 people in the United States testing positive for COVID-19. We have, I think, about 40,000 plus people who have recovered from the disease, but about 20,000 people who have passed away as a result of this infection. So could you tell us about what's happening in the US and a little bit about how the pandemic has spread before we talk about the core of our discussion today, which is the political and the leadership response to this, US and India relations, the elections, and more?
Sure. So one of the more astonishing things that one has seen is the US has become the sort of epicenter of this pandemic, or at least the country with the most number of casualties and most number of fatalities, much more than China, where it all began, although the Chinese numbers are dubious, and much more than many European countries where it passed through, including Italy, France, Spain. So it's hard to get one's head around why is the United States of all countries, I mean, the largest and supposedly the greatest country on earth, harboring so many casualties and fatalities. And the more I think about it, there are a couple of reasons I can think of. One is because the US has fairly open borders in the sense that it takes in a lot of tourist traffic, business traffic, immigrant traffic, a lot of people coming into this country all the time. So in that sense, it's a fairly porous country. And if you notice, actually, all the countries which have very high number of COVID cases are very high tourist intensive countries. France, Italy, Spain also have a large number of tourists. So that's one reason. But the more interesting thing is, most people agree that there's an appalling failure of leadership on part of the United States, both globally in terms of meeting this pandemic as a challenge. For over 70 years, ever since World War II, the United States always has taken the lead in many, many battles in this world. And for once, the US is at the receiving end. A failure of domestic leadership, too. I think most people agree that Mr. Trump has come up short in this battle, that he was a little lax and airy throughout January and February when the virus first started spreading across the United States.
Thanks, Chidanand. So around the time that this was declared as a pandemic, sometime in January, that's when we sort of started seeing these responses. Like you mentioned, especially New York is a melting pot, the US is a melting pot. So what kind of actions were taken early on and what have you seen happen now? Maybe first we can start at the federal level, because along with the Trump administration, the Centers for Disease Control is considered a gold standard of an epidemiological institution in the world, right? I mean, it's sort of respected perhaps almost along the same lines as the WHO and others. So could you tell us the nature of the response in the United States first few months and now, and what happened at the national level?
I can personalize it a bit and relate it to India and tell you the way I saw it. So throughout January, we knew approximately in the middle of January that this virus had started to go out of China, out of Wuhan. They were shutting down Wuhan. And towards the end of January, it was fairly obvious that this was going to be a serious issue. We now know with the benefit of hindsight that there was a lot of internal deliberation in the US, the CDC, and even Mr. Trump's own aides actually started writing up memos But publicly, if you recall, Mr. Trump absolutely, kept waving it away as if it didn't exist. And this touched me in a very personal way, and I'll tell you why. Around the end of January, we knew that Mr. Trump was going to be visiting India in February. In fact, the dates were known approximately, actually, as February 24, 25. And because I was going to be visiting India to cover the visit, I actually held back from booking my tickets because I kept thinking this may not go through because the visit may not happen because there's this pandemic and could soon be touching Europe and the rest of the world, the United States. I believe it was January 27th. I actually wrote an op-ed in the Times of India, which focused on this. So it was on my radar too. Around that time, the CDC and all these people were starting to issue memos. But politically, Mr. Trump seemed completely oblivious to it. And in fact, throughout the first 3 weeks of February, I held back from booking my ticket. My wife kept asking me, aren't you going to India? And I said, I'll wait till the last moment because I don't know if the visit will go through. And as it turned out, Mr. Trump went through with that visit. You'd remember on 24th February, he landed in Ahmedabad. He had a great rally. On 25th, he went to Delhi, and I was there in Delhi. And on 25th, as he was leaving, I actually wrote another op-ed on the visit. And the first line of the op-ed I actually asked, it was the very first line of the op-ed. I said, why are Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump hugging each other in this time of coronavirus?
I mean, that is a proxy and a signal for perhaps everything else that is happening, right? Things should not have been business as usual in February or in March.
Absolutely. So what I'm saying is that it was so obvious. I'm a layperson. I don't have any classified information. And it was obvious to me that this was going to be a serious problem, even as he left US. And if you remember, when he was landing in Ahmedabad, actually, Trump tweeted something to the effect of, this is no big deal, the virus. The stock market is doing great. We'll do great. And even when he came back, I think it took him another 3 or 4 days to realize the seriousness of it. So throughout February, again, no action. And this was the subject of much argument today at a White House briefing where a CBS correspondent really grilled Trump saying, what did you do throughout February? Because Trump keeps insisting that he stopped all flights in January from China. So this journalist asked him, but what did you do with that time? You had all of February. You did nothing. And I think the president lost his temper a bit, and you'll probably see it on TV throughout the day. So yeah, much of February, politically, the US did very little in terms of preparation, in terms of prepping the states, in terms of prepping the people. Throughout February, the message was, oh, it'll go away. This is no big deal. It's just on the flu.
So, Chidanand, what do you see as the first serious actions that the United States took at the federal level? Because here, a lockdown started from the government of India's level downwards. Before that, there were sort of rules and certain things passed at the state level. So how do you see that happening in the United States? Who started taking action first?
Mr. Trump finally had to act after he came back. So again, let me just rewind a little bit. So when I landed in Delhi, I came on 21 or 22. Straight off at the airport, I could see people wearing masks. In the Delhi airport on February 22, 2 days before Mr. Trump's visit, there were people wearing masks in the New Delhi airport. And I was impressed. I said, okay, it's being taken more seriously in India. From Delhi, I came to Bangalore to visit my dad. And I was supposed to go on to Gulf for 3 or 4 days and come back on March 5. But on March 1, my wife called and said, forget the Gulf trip. This is getting serious. I want you right back. And we have 3 young kids. She was already worried. So I actually scrapped the Gulf trip. So here's my wife who's already starting to panic, saying, we're not getting hand sanitizers or masks in Washington, D.C. or on Amazon. You couldn't order it by March 1, 2. They were all gone. And in fact, I went to 4 medical stores in Bangalore, and I found even there the shortages were beginning. I actually did a post blog saying, why does a hand sanitizer of 200 ounces cost 265 rupees in India? It's so expensive.
So Chidanand, for decades, we've had family and guests and friends who are returning from the US with gifts that were not accessible to us in India. This is a pleasant surprise to hear that, you are able to take supplies and gifts from Bangalore and India back to the United States where you don't have availability there.
So a lot of people had realized by the end of February that this was going to be a serious issue. Throughout all this, Mr. Trump was gung-ho about the economy. And in fact, the White House economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, if I'm not mistaken, on February 24th, said, hey, this is a great time to invest in the stock market. And by then, the virus was already in the United States. So it was not until the first week of March that they really started to get serious about this. And by then, of course, I think the first deaths were being reported in Washington state.
So here, do you see, apart from Mr. Trump and what was happening, like you said, there were memos being written up, there were things happening in the background, even though executive decisions might not have been taken based on them. But could you also tell us a little bit about Anthony Fauci, who's the other face of the response to the pandemic in the US?
I'm quite sure that if you ask 95% or 99% of Americans wouldn't have known who Dr. Fauci is, before the first week of March.
I mean, even I had to figure out how to pronounce and spell his name when this whole thing started.
Even though he's one of the longest serving government officials in the US, I think he's served through 5 or 6 presidents going back to George Bush Sr., the chief infectious diseases specialist in the US across decades. And he was finally pushed to the forefront because he was considered the most authoritative figure. He's been front and center. And in fairness, I think it's now increasingly clear that even Dr. Fauci in January and February was kind of, I'd say, laid back. He also said people should go around their business quite normally. I really think a lot of people, even specialists, did not, I think, appreciate the term I'd use is selective lethality of this virus, because we know now there's sufficient data to show that this virus is fairly benign in many people. A lot of people have the virus, test positive, but are asymptomatic and show no discomfort at all. Literally, not even like an ordinary flu, but they're positive. But in some people, it is brutal. So we're starting to see that this virus plays havoc in the sense of, not just its lethality, but also the way it spreads very asymptomatically through people who show no signs of carrying the virus. So this, I think, initially caused a lot of people to be fairly relaxed. There were arguments, I think, including Mr. Trump at one time said, so it's just like a flu. And many people have pointed out that the flu kills about anything from 40 to 60,000 people annually in the United States. Flu and complications from flu. There are a lot of comorbidity issues involved here.
This is in spite of the yearly vaccinations and that whole cycle.
Absolutely.
Chidanand, if I could come in here.
Sure.
You mentioned Dr. Fauci through February also was a bit lukewarm about the threat.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
There is also mention that there is a certain kind of tension between the president and Dr. Fauci, and he needs to tread a line where he doesn't want to get sacked in a certain sense. And, America loses that voice of reason, if I can call it that.
Right.
Is that something that has been operational? Have you seen in the sense that Dr. Fauci says something which sort of toes the official line, but in between also slips in what he thinks as a scientist needs to be done? Is some of that operating?
It's not just Dr. Fauci. That's pretty much everybody around Mr. Trump. Okay, we know now we have 3.5 years record of a very tempestuous man in office who has a very fragile ego and very thin skin. It's not just him. It's not just domestic experts, other politicians in the US, but also global leaders. Everyone treads on eggshells around him because nobody wants to displease him. So yes, I think Dr. Fauci has had to tread on eggshells, but he has been quietly forceful, and it has largely been because of him that this whole lockdown started, rolling out. And it's also because of him that the lockdown has been extended, because left to himself, heard Mr. Trump express openly that he wanted the country and the economy reopened on Easter Sunday. And now he wants it reopened on May 1. And in fact, he's constituted a Reopen America committee today with his daughter and son-in-law in the committee. So this is a man who's itching to reopen the country because he realizes his re-election prospects are tied to the economy.
So one more question, Chidanand. Mr. Trump is holding these daily press conferences, some run even up to 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And Wall Street Journal has said it is not helping what he's doing.
Right.
What's your take about these press conferences? Because you have a task force which is headed by the vice president.
Right.
So how do you see the role of these press conferences in the overall context for people to understand what the federal government is doing?
These press conferences, they've basically taken the place of his rallies. You see, because of the shutdown, he's not been able to go on the road and address his faithfuls, the MAGA rallies. And this is just a substitute. I think we know by now that publicity and speaking publicly is his oxygen. And in as much as he abuses the media and, his constant barrage of fake news and so on, he can't live without the media. And this is not just now, not from the time he became president. It's even before, even when he was a businessman, when he was a young man. He revels in talking to the media. He wants to be constantly in the news. You'll notice, despite all his so-called despising of the media, he always entertains questions, and his press conferences actually run interminably till actually journalists get bored and want to switch off. And he's very quick to talk about his ratings. I mean, can you imagine throughout this whole incredible pandemic, he's had time to boast about how his press conferences topped the ratings. I think initially, at least, everyone tuned in to listen to Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. But for Mr. Trump, it's theater. It's political theater. There's been a lot of talk among the press corps that they should simply, boycott this press conference. But I think a lot of people also want to listen to Dr. Fauci and others to see what, hard data rather than just rhetoric. Today's press conference, incidentally, set a new record. It went on for, I think, 2 hours, 24 minutes. So it's just getting longer and longer.
So the two follow-ups on this. One, I think Mr. Trump has claimed that the federal government has the final authority on all matters when it comes to dealing with the pandemic. The second, how do you see the contrast in this communication style and this leadership style with somebody like Governor Cuomo in New York, where New York now has close to 40%, 50% of all the cases in the United States? Could you sort of compare both the federal versus state powers in this and the styles of leadership in this?
It's a very interesting development, Pavan, and this is actually very new. It's happened over the last 24, 48 hours. Let me give you a little bit of background.
Chidanand, if I can ask for a clarification, I think when you say lockdown and we say lockdown here in India, we probably mean slightly different things, right? Because a lockdown in Bangalore pretty much cannot leave our houses. So even if you have to step out, wear a mask, ideally go on foot. If you're in a vehicle, you might be stopped. So tell us what an American lockdown is for a minute before we continue so that we know what we mean by the term.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, Pavan, because I believe from what I hear from my family and friends, the Indian lockdown is fairly severe. I can tell you in the US, and at least in my neck of the woods, I'm just outside Washington, D.C., about 6 miles from the White House, but in Maryland state, which is adjoining the Washington district. The lockdown is fairly relaxed in the sense that the big stores are open for groceries. We can go grocery shopping. We can go to the parks and trails. In Maryland, actually, I discovered yesterday that you can continue to have construction activities. If you have a civil project at home, building an addition or building a new home, you can continue that. You can hire workers to repair stuff, to work on your yard, your garden. Also, public works are going on. I see road works going on, infrastructure work going on. The trails where I walk and run, I see a lot of people. In fact, it's more crowded than usual because everyone is at home all day and everyone wants a walk. But the social distancing aspect is fairly well observed. People keep a distance, but this is a big country. There's also enough space. The ratio I always mention is 4 Indias can fit into the United States, and the US has 1/4 the Indian population. So,
Chidanand, coming back to the governor issue, I mean, you made a very interesting point. The preeminence of governors historically, which was lost. And in a sense, I think Cuomo in New York and Gavin Newsom in California represent a certain kind of governorship at this moment. At the same time, we find Texas, Florida has been a lot more lax. How do you explain these variation in state response? Is it politics?
One is politics. The other thing that crossed my mind is, the coronavirus cases are mostly in areas which, again, entertain a lot of trade and traffic. Washington state, It's the headquarters of Microsoft, Amazon, Boeing. It's a trade-heavy state with a lot of international traffic coming in and going out. New York, of course, and these are the two states which had the maximum number of cases. If you notice, a lot of Middle America states, I think there were 7 or 8 states, which were the last to sign up to this lockdown. And even then, with a lot of resistance, and because they had the fewest cases, they're thinly populated. Not too many people go there. North Dakota, South Dakota. I think Wyoming recorded its first death yesterday. It was the last state. For the longest time, Wyoming did not have any coronavirus sort of cases and no deaths till yesterday. This is Middle America, which does not engage a whole great deal with the rest of the world. All of them have, I think, 2 senators and 1 congressman. The sense I've got is the more engaged a state is with the world in terms of trade, tourism, traffic, the more, coronavirus cases there were. And also, I think population density, a lot of Middle America is very sparsely populated. So there wasn't a whole lot of danger. And the governors there resisted this lockout because, first of all, they have that frontier spirit. They don't like being told what to do. 2, some of these states are also ultra-religious. There have been battles on the religious front with some of the churches saying, if you're going to get coronavirus, so be it. It's God's will, and so on. It's quite an incredible story that, Middle America resisted lockdown for a long time.
Chidanand, so moving on to one other important distinction between, say, the United States and India is that India had its elections last year. I cannot imagine what the election cycle would be in India right now with COVID happening in parallel. But that is the situation in the United States. And we know the theater, the circus, the long drawn out campaigns that are part and parcel of the American presidential campaigns. So given that this is happening in the election year, can you tell us about how the Democrats, the opposition, are thinking this through? Now we have a presumptive Democratic nominee in Biden. How do you see the campaign politics play out in the time of COVID?
Pavan, first of all, since you mentioned India, I have to say this. I have incredible admiration for our political system and electoral system because I lived through and covered an election which was interrupted by an assassination. If you recall, Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated in the middle of an election. Half the election had been completed. It was just an incredible time. And it speaks so much of our resilience, even though we're a much younger democracy, that we actually came through that trial. And also much later, if you remember, there were 3 elections in 3 years during the early Vajpayee years. So I just have immense respect for our system, for our electoral system. With all its imperfections, it's great. In the United States, it's more clockwork. But again, amazing in a different sense that they elect their president every 4 years with metronomic precision, efficiency. The election itself may not be perfect, as we found out, but the timetable is set that every 4 years, and this for 240 plus years, they've done this with great regularity. No changes, including through world wars and depression and all that. So everyone expects that there will be an election the second Tuesday of November this year. And the candidates are well known. There is some talk that Mr. Trump may use this if it gets really serious. He's joked about being a ruler in perpetuity and so on. I believe that's his fantasy. But otherwise, the election will be, I think, on schedule. The question, though, is the mechanics of it. The US system, they have this convention, which is more like a sort of jamboree where the candidates are already decided, but there's a formal coronation kind of takes place. But the Republican convention was always scheduled in August, and they, I think, intend to keep those dates. The Democrats were supposed to have a convention in July, and they have advanced it to August. So there'll be 2 conventions in August. I think everyone's hoping by then the virus thing would have ebbed and they'll be able to go through with it. But I can imagine that it'll be a much more subdued convention. American conventions are famous. By the way, I've been to almost every convention for the last 25 years. It's a very touchy-feely, huggy atmosphere. A lot of very bonhomous, a lot of glad handling, backslapping, lot of parties, lot of drinking, socializing goes on. It's one big party within the party.
And all of them sound like things that should not be done anytime near a pandemic.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So here you were already talking about how Mr. Trump is using his daily pressers, which are getting longer and longer, as a part of his campaign strategy as well. Now, what kind of a platform does the Democratic presumptive nominee Joe Biden have? What is his team and what are the Democrats doing in their campaigning and otherwise during this time?
I don't know if you saw that today's headline was Bernie Sanders has endorsed Biden, which was expected, but it kind of happened very early. If you look at previous elections, Sanders did not endorse Hillary Clinton till very late, just before the convention, actually.
We remember how fractious it was back then. It was almost like three parties fighting.
Going back to even 2008, Hillary Clinton took her own sweet time endorsing Barack Obama. Usually a lot of negotiation takes place when trying to put across your points and your policies into your rival's platform. But I get a sense that Bernie Sanders has done this early because I think the big issue really in this election is going to be healthcare, precisely because of the pandemic. I think, as you know, Sanders was very strong on that. He wanted universal healthcare, and a lot of people thought that's over the top, the socialist agenda. But a lot of Americans are secretly now closet socialists because after all this, one of the big lessons that this pandemic has taught us is that you do require big government. Problems can only be solved by the government. There is no private enterprise, there's no corporation which can tackle something on this scale. So I believe, healthcare will be a big issue, and I believe that's why Sanders has come out early. He'll probably push through a lot of his agenda onto the Biden platform.
So do you think universal healthcare will become sort of the linchpin of the conversation and the campaign going forward? Do you see other things also playing an important role?
Definitely that will be one of the big issues. I think Biden will have to sort of open his mind to that, one. And two, there's another big thing, Pavan and Ravi, and I'd love to hear from you also about this. This whole epidemic has shocked America, right? It has really shaken them up because they've suddenly realized that for all their greatest power, sole superpower, yada, 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 they were completely unprepared. I mean, this is a country which has 5,000, 10,000 most powerful nuclear weapons. And, it's been brought down to its knees by a pathogen. And one of the realizations which is seeping through every single day, every single hour, I sense it, is that this country suddenly realized that, we have ceded a lot of our capabilities to others, particularly in manufacturing. They suddenly discover that this is a country which can't even get gloves and masks and basic medication for its people when it's really required because all the manufacturing is outside the country. And I believe this is really going to shake up a lot of things. And in fairness, this is something Trump actually spoke about, not specifically about pharma and drug. I don't think that was as big an issue with him as other manufacturing ability. He often spoke about steel and aluminum. He was very resentful of the fact that the US had ceded its steel and aluminum manufacturing to other countries. And he kept saying, this is a strategic issue. We should get it back. There are a lot of manufacturing that he wanted to bring back and did succeed in bring back to the US. And that means that now it's opened their eyes to many other areas in manufacturing where they're vulnerable. And in some sense, I believe this is another Sputnik moment for the US when the Soviets suddenly jumped them and, went ahead in the space race, and how much it hurt American pride. And they came, roaring back with the Apollo missions till they finally landed a man on the moon. So I think there's going to be a lot of rethink, whether it is Trump or whether it's Biden who ends in November. I think this country is going to rethink this whole idea of globalization and ceding manufacturing to other countries. I keep wondering how that will affect India.
Actually, Chidanand, it is how it's going to work globally. I think people are going to look at this whole global supply chain model and rethink it. For example, we have traditionally had a Make in India campaign. I see that extending to Make in India for India. So you're going to have these Make in USA for USA kind of stories that will evolve as a result of the pandemic.
If I may add, this is sort of economic nationalism that is on the rise, right? This is Swadeshi in a new bottle. So in that sense, while healthcare might become this big issue and the current administration in the US might be seen as, anti-universal healthcare and people who've been scuttling that ecosystem, at the same time, Trump has long positioned himself as the leader who is going to take on China right? So in that sense, as the person who has a greater weight in saying that, look, I'm trying to contain China, that might also feed into the election narrative as well as policy making across the United States and the world, right? We've seen COVID and SARS-CoV-2 also being referred to as the China virus by many US politicians. So we'll have to see how the geopolitics of this plays out. If you're speaking geopolitics, I do want to come to India, because we've seen tweet threats and more that have been exchanged between the United States and India, especially around this issue of hydroxychloroquine, whose efficacy is completely unknown right now as prophylaxis or prevention or curative, anything. But Donald Trump threatening India if it doesn't receive HCQ from India, and then India acceded. So how do you see that playing out between US and India politics?
I think Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi are both fairly transactional people. I think Modi, I get a sense that he understands Trump much better than many other leaders. He knows how to play to his ego. He also knows when to give in. I believe in this whole chloroquine episode, some of it was actually based on a misunderstanding. From the sequence I could piece together, Mr. Trump initially, his tweet was, I've asked India to release what the United States has already ordered. He was not seeking any fresh consignment. There was a contractual thing. And India had banned exports by then. So the US consignment was held up. And the Indian ban actually followed a US ban on exports. So in that sense, it was reciprocal. It was the US which started it. And the Indians responded. And then Trump tweeted saying, well, at least send us what we have already ordered. And the Indian government agreed immediately. I don't think there was any dispute about that. All right, your order is already there, it's packed, and they pretty much shipped it. And Trump was very congenial after that. And I think there are things that the Indians would also like. Actually, in the last 2-3 days, I've gotten a lot of calls and a lot of messages. At any given time, there are 200,000 Indian students in the US. And a lot of them, particularly graduating students, they're about to graduate this year. They're in a very bad shape because school has been suspended. Many of the dorms have been emptied out. Many of the kids are running out of visas, and they have this OPT optional practical training period of 60 days. That is going to get eaten up by this pandemic. And many students depend on that to look for jobs, to graduate into a permanent job here, or permanent in the sense at least a visa-based job, what's called the H-1B visa. So all that has been completely derailed. I've had many messages from students saying, we don't know what will happen. Will they extend our visa? Can we still go through with the OPT? When will all these end? So I believe that is being negotiated between India and US. I believe Indian diplomats told me that they have been apprising the US State Department of these difficulties. A lot of Indian parents, by the way, over the years, I've seen every year more and more parents come for their kids' graduation here. And I've had at least 2 or 3 parents who have called me and said, well, looks like we're not going to be there in May, which is the sort of graduation convocation season. So all that has got derailed. So there's a lot of give and take. And since you mentioned that the hydroxychloroquine efficacy is doubtful, there's no point holding it back, at least what the US has ordered. So actually yesterday, the ambassador tweeted a picture of the first consignment of hydroxychloroquine landing in New Jersey. So yeah, I don't see any issues here. I think the two countries now have comfort level in sort of give and take.
I think we can comfortably ship more so long as, Indians living in the United States and working in the United States get offered a few more protections in these extraordinary times, right? Graduating students, people on their OPTs trying to get an H-1B. I mean, there was supposed to be an H-1B lottery that usually gets announced at the end of March, right? And there is a lot of confusion whether anyone has gotten it so far.
Absolutely, yeah. We don't even know whether they processed it because April 1 is usually the day they say that it has been decided, and I didn't hear anything about it. The ambassador had a talk session with students yesterday or day before, and a lot of students were pleading about issues. He said, listen, the visa is the last thing on this administration's mind right now. So he just counseled them to be just, patient and hang in. This is America, which has been badly exposed by this pandemic, and there's a sense of schadenfreude, laughing at America's discomfort. But I think the correct way to play this is to say we are partners and we are ready to help. You help us too.
Absolutely. I think going forward, when it comes to vaccines, when it comes to new diagnostics, we're not just looking at China, but also out of innovation out of the United States.
Since you mentioned China, this is a moment of great discomfort for China too. It's a time that India can step up and show that it's a responsible member of global order. I would not write out the US at all. If anything, like I said, it's a Sputnik moment. They have realized that they have been shown up terribly, and this country could come roaring back as they did with the Apollo mission. So we need to be on the right side of history.
So Chidanand, thank you so much for giving us this personal as well as overarching overview of what's happening in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us on BIC Talks.
Thank you, Pavan. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you very much. It's lovely being with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. You can get our podcast on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in for new episodes every week. Check out Bangalore International Center on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And don't forget to regularly check in on our podcasts.